Mrs. Helen was a kind and gentle woman who had always loved spending time with her son, Jake. Ever since he got married to Lisa, Helen tried her best to build a good relationship with her daughter-in-law. Every Sunday, Jake and Lisa invited Helen over for dinner. It had become a family tradition, and Helen always looked forward to it. Lisa cooked delicious meals, and Helen enjoyed them without any doubt. But lately, something strange had been happening. Every time Helen ate Lisa's food, she felt unwell. At first, it was just mild discomfort, a little dizziness, a small headache, and an upset stomach. She thought it was just her body reacting to different spices, or maybe her old age catching up to her. But over time, things got worse. One evening, after finishing a lovely dinner at Jake and Lisa's house, Helen started feeling weak. As she walked towards the door to leave, her vision blurred for a moment, and she had to grab onto the wall to steady herself. Jake noticed and rushed to her side. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, concern in his voice. Helen forced a smile and nodded. "I think I just stood up too fast," she said, trying to dismiss the worry in his eyes. Lisa stood nearby, watching them closely, her face unreadable. Helen assured them she would be fine and went home. But as soon as she reached her house, nausea hit her hard. She barely made it to the bathroom before she started vomiting. Lying in bed that night, Helen couldn't ignore the thought creeping into her mind. Why did this keep happening after eating Lisa's food? It wasn't the first time. She tried to remember if she had eaten anything else that could have caused it, but nothing seemed unusual. She had been perfectly fine before dinner. Still, she didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe she was just overthinking. But the feeling in her gut told her something was wrong. The next week, Helen hesitated before going to Jake's house. She felt a strange sense of fear that she couldn't explain. But she didn't want to refuse the invitation and upset her son. So she went. Lisa greeted her warmly, as always, and soon dinner was served. The food looked and smelled amazing, just like every other time. Helen picked up her fork and started eating, but there was an uneasiness inside her. She tried to push away the doubts, telling herself she was just being paranoid. But halfway through the meal, she felt it again. That familiar dizziness creeping in. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed her fork down. Her stomach tightened, and her head felt heavy. Jake was happily chatting about his work, unaware of Helen's discomfort. Lisa, however, seemed to be paying close attention to Helen. Her eyes flickered toward Helen's plate, every now and then, as if waiting for something. Helen swallowed hard, a strange chill running down her spine. Was Lisa watching her? Was she imagining things? She felt the air grow heavy around her, making it difficult to breathe. Helen forced herself to finish dinner, not wanting to raise suspicion. But inside, her heart pounded with fear. That night, the sickness returned with full force. Helen spent hours in the bathroom, her body shaking from nausea and exhaustion. She gripped the sink, staring at her pale reflection in the mirror. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a coincidence. Something was definitely wrong with the food. And the most terrifying part, Lisa's watchful eyes at dinner. It almost felt like she had been waiting for this to happen. Helen's mind raced with questions she didn't want to ask. Could Lisa be doing something to her food? But why? What reason could she possibly have? Helen had always been kind to Lisa, treating her like her own daughter. But the thought wouldn't leave her mind. The more she tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. Fear curled around her heart like a tight grip, refusing to let go. Lying awake in bed, Helen realized she couldn't just sit back and let this continue. She needed to find out the truth. But how? If she told Jake, would he even believe her? Lisa was his wife, and he loved her deeply. Helen didn't want to create trouble in their marriage unless she was absolutely sure. She had to be careful. She had to gather proof. And most importantly, she had to protect herself before it was too late. Helen woke up the next morning feeling weak and drained. Her body ached from the night before, and she could barely find the strength to get out of bed. The sickness had taken everything out of her. As she slowly sat up, she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself. This wasn't just some ordinary stomach problem. Something was wrong. Deep down, she knew it had to be the food. But what could she do? She needed to be careful. She couldn't accuse Lisa without proof. Later that day, Helen decided to call Jake. She wanted to talk to him, to tell him what was happening. When he picked up, his voice was cheerful, unaware of the storm brewing in Helen's heart. "Hey, Mom, how are you feeling?" he asked. Helen hesitated before answering. She didn't want to sound weak or overly suspicious. "I'm okay," she said softly. "Just a little tired." "Jake, I wanted to ask, have you ever felt sick after eating at home?" There was silence on the other end for a moment before Jake chuckled. "No, of course not. Lisa is an amazing cook. You know that." Helen pressed her lips together, unsure of what to say next. Should she tell him how she had been feeling after every meal at their house? Would he even believe her? Taking a deep breath, she decided to test the waters. "It's just, I don't know. Lately, after eating at your place, I haven't been feeling well." She expected Jake to show concern, but instead he laughed lightly. "Mom, maybe your stomach is just getting sensitive. You know, with age, some foods don't sit well." His words stung a little. He wasn't taking her seriously. She wanted to argue, but something stopped her. If she pushed too hard, he might think she was blaming Lisa for no reason. She couldn't afford to lose Jake's trust, so she swallowed her frustration and forced a small laugh. "Maybe you're right," she said, but inside, her doubts only grew stronger. She couldn't ignore the truth. She was getting sick, and it always happened after eating Lisa's food. She needed a way to find out for sure. The next Sunday, Helen prepared for dinner differently. This time, she decided to bring her own food. It was a simple dish, something she had cooked herself at home. When she arrived at Jake and Lisa's house, she smiled warmly and greeted them like always. Lisa welcomed her in, her usual charming smile on her face. "I made your favorite dish today, Mom," Lisa said sweetly. Helen's stomach twisted at those words, but she kept her expression calm. "That's so kind of you, dear," Helen replied. "But I actually brought my own food today. My stomach has been acting up lately, so I thought I'd eat something light." She watched Lisa's face closely, looking for any reaction. For a split second, something flashed in Lisa's eyes. Something dark, something unsettling. But it disappeared just as quickly as it came. Lisa smiled again, but this time, it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, that's okay," she said. "I just wanted to make something special for you." As they sat down to eat, Helen carefully watched Lisa's movements. Lisa didn't look at her much, but there was a stiffness in her body that Helen hadn't noticed before. It was subtle, but it was there. Helen slowly ate her own food while Jake happily enjoyed the meal Lisa had cooked. Every bite Helen took felt like a silent test. Would she feel sick this time? Would the dizziness come back? She finished her plate, wiped her mouth, and waited. Minutes passed, then an hour, and nothing happened. For the first time in weeks, she felt completely fine after dinner. No dizziness, no nausea, no headache. A chill ran down her spine as realization sank in. It was true. The food was the problem. The food that Lisa cooked. Helen's heart pounded in her chest. She had proof now, at least for herself. But she still didn't know why. Why would Lisa do this to her? And more importantly, what exactly was in that food? Helen knew one thing for sure. She couldn't stop now. She had to find out the truth, no matter what it took. "You said." Helen lay awake in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. Her heart pounded as the truth sank deeper into her mind. The food was the problem. Lisa's food. It was no longer just a suspicion. It was real. But what could she do now? She had no proof other than her own experience. If she told Jake, he would think she was being paranoid. He loved Lisa too much to believe something so shocking. No, she couldn't rush. She had to be smart. She had to find out what was in that food. The next morning, Helen woke up with a plan. She would pretend everything was normal, just like before. But this time, she would be more careful. She needed to get a sample of Lisa's food without anyone noticing. That way, she could take it to a doctor or a lab and have it tested. If there was something harmful in it, she would finally have proof. The thought made her nervous, but she had no choice. She had to protect herself. The following Sunday, Helen arrived at Jake and Lisa's house as usual. She put on her warmest smile, acting like nothing was wrong. Lisa greeted her cheerfully, just like always. "I made something special for you today, Mom," she said, leading Helen to the dining table. Helen forced a small laugh. "You always do, dear," she replied, hiding the unease in her voice. As the food was served, Helen's stomach tightened. The plate in front of her looked delicious, just like every time before. Lisa was a great cook, there was no doubt about that. But Helen knew there was something hidden in it. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up her fork. She had to be careful. She couldn't just refuse to eat, or Lisa would get suspicious. Slowly, she took small bites, chewing slowly, pretending to enjoy the meal. But instead of swallowing every bite, she carefully slipped tiny pieces of food into a tissue in her lap. Her heart raced with fear. If Lisa caught her, what would happen? Would she act innocent, or would her mask finally slip? Helen had no idea what Lisa was truly capable of, and that thought terrified her. Jake was busy talking about his work, completely unaware of the silent battle happening across the table. Lisa, however, kept glancing at Helen every now and then. Was she waiting for Helen to get sick again? Helen kept her face neutral, forcing herself to act normal. When dinner was finally over, Helen sighed in relief. She excused herself to the bathroom, taking the tissue with the food sample hidden inside. Once inside, she quickly wrapped it in another tissue and placed it inside her purse. Her hands were shaking. She had done it. She had the proof she needed. Now she just had to get it tested. As she walked back to the living room, she felt Lisa's eyes on her. There was something unsettling about the way Lisa looked at her, something calculating. Helen forced a smile. "Dinner was wonderful, dear." "Thank you," she said, trying to sound normal. Lisa smiled back, but it didn't feel real. It felt forced. Helen knew one thing for sure as she left their house that night. Lisa was hiding something, and soon, Helen would find out exactly what it was. "You said." Helen barely slept that night. Her mind kept replaying the evening over and over. She had done it. She had taken a sample of Lisa's food without getting caught. But now came the hardest part. She needed to get it tested. She had never done anything like this before, and the thought made her anxious. What if she was wrong? What if there was nothing in the food? What if she was just imagining things? But then she remembered the sickness, the dizziness, the way Lisa watched her every time she ate. No, she wasn't imagining it. Something was in that food, and she needed to know what. The next morning, she called her old friend, Dr. Mason, who had been their family doctor for years. "Dr. Mason, I need your help," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "It's something serious." The doctor, hearing the worry in her voice, told her to come in right away. Helen wasted no time. She grabbed her purse, making sure the food sample was still safely hidden, and hurried to the clinic. When she arrived, Dr. Mason welcomed her with a warm smile. "Helen, what's wrong?" he asked gently. She hesitated for a moment before opening her purse and pulling out the wrapped tissue. "I need you to test this," she said in a low voice. The doctor frowned, looking at the tissue. "Test it? For what?" Helen swallowed hard. I think there's something in my food. I keep getting sick after eating at my son's house." She felt embarrassed saying it out loud, but Dr. Mason didn't laugh. His face grew serious. "You think someone is poisoning you?" he asked carefully. Helen's heart pounded. The word poisoning sounded so harsh, so terrifying. But wasn't that exactly what was happening? I don't know, she whispered. But I need to find out. Dr. Mason nodded. All right, I'll have it tested right away. It might take a day or two to get the results. Helen felt a lump in her throat. A day or two. That meant she had to act normal around Lisa until then. Could she do it? She had no choice. The waiting was torture. Helen tried to go about her day as usual, but the anxiety never left her. Every time her phone rang, she jumped, hoping it was Dr. Mason with the results. At the same time, she dreaded what he might say. What if the food really was poisoned? What did that mean? Would she have to tell Jake? Would he even believe her? Finally, after 2 long days, the call came. Helen's hands shook as she answered. Helen, Dr. Mason's voice was calm but firm. I need you to come to the clinic. We need to talk. Helen's stomach dropped. She could hear it in his voice. Something was wrong. She grabbed her coat and rushed to the clinic, her heart pounding in her chest. When she arrived, Dr. Mason didn't waste any time. He looked her in the eye and said, Helen, we found traces of a toxic substance in the food sample you gave me. Helen felt the room spin. Toxic substance. The words echoed in her mind. She gripped the edge of the chair. What kind of substance? She whispered. Dr. Mason sighed. It's a slow-acting poison. It won't kill immediately, but over time, it weakens the body, making the person sick again and again. If someone keeps consuming it, the damage could become serious. Helen's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't just some bad ingredient. Someone had been poisoning her food on purpose. Lisa. Helen's hands clenched into fists. The sweet, caring daughter-in-law who always smiled, who always acted innocent. She had been trying to harm her. But why? What had Helen done to deserve this? She had always treated Lisa with kindness, always welcomed her into the family. So why would Lisa do something so cruel? Dr. Mason placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Helen, you need to be careful. This isn't an accident. Someone is doing this intentionally. Helen swallowed hard, nodding. I know, she said, her voice firm, and I need to find out why. She left the clinic with a new determination. She had the proof now. Lisa had been poisoning her. But the biggest question still remained. Why? Helen knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let this go. She had to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. And this time, Lisa wouldn't see it coming. Helen walked home in a daze, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Lisa had been poisoning her. Lisa wanted her sick. But why? What had she done to deserve this? Helen had always treated Lisa like family, always been kind to her. What could have possibly made Lisa hate her enough to do something so cruel? As she reached her house, she sat down on the couch, gripping her phone tightly. Her first instinct was to call Jake and tell him everything. But then she hesitated. Would he believe her? Or would he think she was imagining things? Lisa was his wife, the woman he loved. What if he defended her? What if he refused to listen? Helen couldn't afford to take that risk. Not yet. She had to be smart. She needed to find out Lisa's motive before making any accusations. If she confronted Lisa now, she might deny everything. And worse, she might become more careful. Helen needed to act normal, pretend like she didn't know the truth, while secretly finding out what Lisa was up to. A plan started forming in her mind. She needed to go back to Jake's house and look for clues. Maybe Lisa had left something behind. A bottle of poison, strange medicine, or even a receipt for something suspicious. If she could find hard evidence, then Jake would have no choice but to believe her. That Sunday, Helen went to dinner as usual. She forced herself to smile as Lisa greeted her. "It's so good to see you, Mom," Lisa said sweetly, leading her to the dining table. Helen's stomach twisted at those words. How could she smile so easily, knowing what she had done? "Thank you, dear," Helen replied, keeping her voice steady. "I've been looking forward to this all week." Lisa's lips curled into a satisfied smile. Helen felt sick just looking at her, but she had to stay calm. She couldn't let Lisa suspect a thing. Dinner went on like normal, with Jake happily chatting about his day. Helen barely touched her food, pretending she wasn't very hungry. She watched Lisa carefully, noticing how often she glanced at Helen's plate. Was she waiting for her to eat? Was she waiting for the poison to take effect? Helen felt a cold shiver run down her spine, but she forced herself to act normal. After dinner, she excused herself to the bathroom, but she had no intention of going there. Instead, she quietly slipped into the kitchen. Her heart pounded as she began searching through the cabinets. She checked every shelf, every drawer, looking for anything unusual. And then, just as she was about to give up, she saw it. A small bottle, hidden behind the spice jars. Helen's hands trembled as she pulled it out. The label was in tiny print, but she recognized the name instantly. It was a type of slow-acting poison, the kind that could make someone sick over time, just like Dr. Mason had said. Helen's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The proof. Lisa had been poisoning her all along. Just then, she heard footsteps behind her. Her blood ran cold. She turned around slowly, and there stood Lisa, her arms crossed, a knowing smirk on her face. "Looking for something, Helen?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. Helen's heart pounded in her chest. She had been caught. Helen froze, gripping the small bottle in her trembling hands. Her heart pounded so loudly, she could barely hear anything else. Lisa stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, a sly smile creeping onto her lips. Her eyes, usually warm and friendly, now held something else, something dark. Helen swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. "I was just..." She glanced at the bottle, then back at Lisa. There was no point in pretending anymore. She had been caught, but she wasn't going to back down. "What is this, Lisa?" she asked, her voice firmer now. Lisa let out a small chuckle, tilting her head slightly. "You already know, don't you?" she said, stepping closer. Helen took a step back, gripping the bottle tighter. "Why?" Helen's voice cracked. "What did I ever do to you?" Lisa sighed, as if she were annoyed by the question. Then she leaned against the counter casually, as if this was just a normal conversation. "You always act so innocent, Helen," she said, shaking her head. "But you never noticed, did you? You never saw what you were doing." Helen's brows furrowed. "Saw what?" Lisa's eyes darkened. "Jake," she said, her voice laced with resentment. "You never let him go. You always act like you're his whole world. Like I'm just some outsider. Every decision, every little thing, he always checks with you first. Not me, his wife." Helen's breath caught in her throat. Was this why Lisa hated her? Because she was close to her own son? "Lisa, that's not true," she said, shaking her head. "Jake loves you. He married you. I never." "Stop lying," Lisa snapped, slamming her hand against the counter. Helen flinched. "You always have to be in control, don't you? You can't stand that Jake has a life without you. That's why I had to do something. I had to make you weaker, make you step back." Helen's stomach turned. "So you tried to poison me?" she whispered in disbelief. Lisa smirked. "It was never meant to kill you, Helen. Just keep you sick, keep you out of the way." Helen felt a wave of nausea, but not from poison this time, from pure horror. This woman, the one she had trusted, had smiled at, had called family, had been slowly hurting her all along. She had to get out. Now, taking a deep breath, she steadied her shaking hands. "Jake will find out," she said, trying to sound stronger than she felt. "I have proof now. He'll never forgive you." Lisa's smirk faded. Her eyes flickered with something unreadable: fear, anger. Then, in a low voice, she said, "We'll see about that." Helen didn't wait to find out what she meant. She clutched the bottle and pushed past Lisa, hurrying toward the door. She could hear Lisa's footsteps following behind her, but Helen didn't stop. She rushed into the living room, where Jake was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. "Jake," she gasped, her voice shaky. "We need to talk. Now." Jake looked up, confused. "Mom, what's wrong?" Helen turned, expecting Lisa to still be behind her, but the kitchen was empty. Lisa hadn't followed her. A cold shiver ran down Helen's spine. Lisa wasn't going to let this go easily. But Helen didn't care. She had proof, and now it was time for the truth to come out. Helen took a deep breath, gripping the small bottle in her trembling hands. This was it, the moment everything would be revealed. She turned to Jake, her heart pounding. "Jake, listen to me," she said urgently. "Lisa has been poisoning me." Jake frowned, his face twisting in confusion. "What?" he asked, shaking his head. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Helen opened her hand, showing him the bottle. "I found this in the kitchen. Dr. Mason tested my food. There's poison in it. Lisa has been making me sick." Jake stared at the bottle, his face paling. He looked between Helen and Lisa, who had just walked into the living room, her expression perfectly calm. "Lisa," he said slowly, his voice uncertain. "What is this?" Lisa let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, come on, Jake," she said smoothly. "Are you really going to believe this? Your mother has been acting strange for weeks. She's paranoid. She's making up stories because she doesn't like me." Helen's hands clenched into fists. "That's not true," she snapped. "I wanted to believe you cared about me, Lisa. But you did this. You poisoned me. And I have proof." Lisa's smile faded slightly, but she kept her voice steady. "Jake, do you really think I would ever do something like that?" she said softly, looking at him with wide, innocent eyes. Jake ran a hand through his hair, clearly overwhelmed. He looked back at Helen. "Mom, are you sure?" he asked, his voice filled with hesitation. Helen's heart ached. He didn't want to believe it. He couldn't, but she had no choice. She had to make him see the truth. "Jake, I have been sick every time I eat Lisa's food," Helen said, her voice breaking. "I took a sample to Dr. Mason, and he found poison in it. I found this bottle in your kitchen. I am not imagining this." Jake hesitated, looking at Lisa again. "Tell me the truth," he said, his voice firmer now. Lisa's eyes darkened for a moment, but then she let out a dramatic sigh. "Fine," she said, crossing her arms. "Yes, I put something in her food, but it wasn't poison." Helen's breath caught in her throat. "What?" Lisa shrugged. "It was just a mild herbal remedy," she said. "Something to help her relax. She's always stressed, always trying to control everything. I thought if she felt weaker, she might stop interfering in our lives." Helen stared at her in shock. You wanted me to be weak." Lisa smirked. "You act like I tried to kill you. I just wanted you to back off." Jake's face hardened. "Lisa, you've been drugging my mother." His voice was cold now, filled with anger. Lisa's confidence wavered. "Jake, you don't understand." "No," he interrupted, shaking his head. "I understand perfectly." He looked at Helen, his expression filled with regret. "Mom, I'm so sorry." Helen felt a wave of relief, but it wasn't over yet. She turned back to Lisa, her voice steady. "You need to leave," she said firmly. "Right now." Lisa scoffed, but she could see the fire in Jake's eyes. She had lost. With a huff, she grabbed her purse. "You'll regret this," she muttered before walking out the door. As the door slammed shut, Helen let out a shaky breath. Jake sat down, his head in his hands. "I can't believe this," he whispered. Helen placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know it's hard, but you had to see the truth." Jake nodded slowly. "I'm just glad you're okay, Mom." Helen smiled weakly. She had survived. She had uncovered the truth. And now, finally, she was free.